Kia ora koutou. Welcome to our partners and guests, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Andy O'Hare, and I'm Head of Strategy and Financial Solutions at the Centre for Sustainable Finance. We can go on to the first slide, please. So look, we've got a great guest to talk to us today, and so I want to get right into it. So I'll be quick in setting the scene for the conversation. Financial institutions cannot solve climate change through better risk management, disclosure, and reporting. As Lisa Sachs, Director of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, reminded us in our recent conversation with her, they can only finance what is financeable, and the only response that reduces the underlying climate risk is decarbonisation. And for decarbonisation, we need climate solutions. That raises important questions. Where should effort be focused to achieve the greatest impact? And how do we create the conditions that make climate solutions investable? If you go on to the next slide, please. Dr. Lauren Gifford, Senior Advisor, Climate Philanthropy and Investing at Project Drawdown, one of the world's leading climate solutions organizations, joined us today to consider these and other questions. Dr. Gifford will provide a bit of context as to what Project Drawdown is, explain the science-based approach Project Drawdown utilizes, and discuss how to prioritize the solutions that deliver the greatest emissions reduction while strengthening resilience, nature, and human well-being. Dr. Gifford and I will then discuss what this means for investors, policymakers, and institutions. If questions arise during the presentation or discussion, please submit them using the Q&A function on the webinar platform. We'll have some time at the end to address as many as we can. Okay, so without further ado, I'll hand over to our guests. Dr. Gifford, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Andy. It's great to be here. I was hoping you could have flown me in and we could have all met in person because I have not been to New Zealand, but it seems like the perfect place to visit always. And I will tell the guests, so I have not been to New Zealand, but my husband is from Fiji, so I do have Pacific ties. And I was just like, it's a real honor to be able to speak to this group today. So thank you so much. So I'm Lauren Gifford, and I'm, as Andy said, I'm Senior Advisor of Climate Philanthropy and Investment at Project Drawdown, which is an independent science organization based in the US that provides the world's largest database and insights into climate solutions. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but just to set the stage on who I am. I'm a human environment geographer, so I'm a social scientist, and I've spent about the last 20 years thinking about intersections between climate change and finance. Everything from market mechanisms to tax incentives to new markets like the European emissions trading system. And so happy to talk about all of that and bring that into the Q&A. But first I'm going to set the stage a little bit on why we should care about climate change. So next slide, please. And I think this one, yeah. So like I said, we're Project Drawdown. We're the world's leading guide to science-based climate solutions. We're philanthropically funded. Everything that we have is open source, and it's a resource to a lot of investors, philanthropists, money managers, but also scientists and students. Previously, I was a professor and I used Project Drawdown materials to teach. So it's a really we make really complicated science accessible to anyone, and that's why it's really been a special place to work. But let me talk about climate change a little bit more. So next slide, please. As you know, particularly folks who live on islands, right, in island nations, we are facing a climate crisis. Next slide. And we already know about these significant disruptions, right? There's tropical storms and we're facing fires and more extreme and unpredictable weather patterns. And it is affecting everyone, right? We call this in some ways the Anthropocene, where all of Earth's systems have been irrevocably changed and altered because of increased concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There's no shelter from the storm of climate change. Next slide. But there is good news, right? We know how to build a better, healthier, more prosperous world. And we actually have all the tools to do it. Like, we know what it would take. We just need to enact them. But next slide, and I'll tell you what the problem is, why we haven't. We're falling behind because funding and motivation has been wildly insufficient. And that's both because we see a withdrawal in the policy space, but also that we have never reached the amount of funding that we need to actually move the dial on climate change and enact the amount of the solutions that we know can work. Next slide. So we can and we must do better. And folks who care about sustainable finance, right? Like, I'm preaching to the choir in some ways with this audience. But I want to talk to you a little bit about how we can both use the capital that we've already mobilized to be more efficient, in how we address the climate crisis, but also how we can mobilize more. So next slide. Right, that's where Project Drawdown comes in. And next slide. So science actually shows us which solutions are most effective and where they are most effective, right? There's certain parts of the world where expanding solar or wind power is much more effective. Or an example I'll give later is about a shift in agricultural practices. So next slide. So one of the things that we offer at Project Drawdown is the Drawdown Explorer, where we have over 100 climate solutions online. And you can, the next slide will show you a little bit more about what Drawdown Explorer looks like. We call this the Ultimate Climate Solutions Platform. And each of these solutions, well, first of all, I should tell you that we have a staff of over 20 scientists, PhD level scientists, who work to vet these solutions and use the best available data to identify what we deem highly recommended, what we say keep watching, what we say is not recommended. So next slide. And we call this actionable intelligence for climate leaders. We also have a new platform that we use internally that takes climate finance data and ties it to the taxonomy of this of our Drawdown Explorer and tells us how much capital, it's explicitly venture capital, so how much VC capital and how much philanthropic capital is going to each of these solutions, where and which specific organizations is funding them. So that's something that we use internally right now, but we're expanding it to sort of work with folks like you to say, like, let's look a little bit deeper and maybe we can see what solutions are promising but underfunded. Next slide. So again, we have this Project Drawdown Explorer where we can browse all of these climate solutions and learn more about it. And on the next slide, I'll show you what happens when you click on one of these squares. So we have everything from the basics to the specific climate impacts on greenhouse gases, whether it's carbon dioxide or methane, and also additional or co-benefits. These are things that a lot of investors are interested, particularly in the sustainable development space. Sure, they want the climate solution and they want to fund adaptation or mitigation of climate change, but they also want the job security or the ecosystem restoration or biodiversity benefits. So the database that we have tells us all of that and how solutions impact that. Next slide. So as we know, as people who work in capital, there's challenges and there's opportunities for climate capital. And I'm going to explore some of those right now. Next. So no surprise, far more money is needed. The next couple slides I have are going to talk about philanthropic capital, but it's almost like, and I think maybe in the end when I talked with Andy, we'll talk a little bit more about how the climate space views impact investing versus philanthropic capital, but we need far more in general. Next slide. So and this slide didn't come through, but I will tell you that what this is an image of, it's from a philanthropic tracker called ClimateWorks. out of the US, and it shows that only 2% of all philanthropic giving globally goes to climate mitigation. So we're already dealing with a small piece of the pie, and then that's going by and large to renewable energy development. So all these other climate solutions that we know work and are effective are really underfunded. Next slide, please. And one of the problems is that where money is going is not always aligned with science. And next slide will show you that, but I bet it didn't transfer because it's a graph. Let's see how, let's go through here. So what this is looking at the impact for, on the left where you see carbon impact, that's how much carbon can be addressed, removed, drew down from the atmosphere, drawn down from the atmosphere with silvopasture versus vertical farming or like indoor farming. But on the right side is of the graph, which obviously is like the inverse, is how much more money has gone to vertical farming than silvopasture, right? So we can, this is bonkers to look at, so you can just go to the next slide, but I'll keep talking about it a little bit. So essentially what's happening is the narrative of certain climate certain climate interventions, climate solutions has been very intriguing to philanthropists or the venture capital space, as well as impact investing, right? They tell a good story. They have promising tech that isn't quite tested yet. And we see a lot of capital going to these spaces, and they're really missing opportunities that can help us address the climate crisis. Next slide. We can also use capital to de-risk and accelerate what we call keep watching solutions. So there's these solutions that we think are really promising, but they haven't scaled yet, or we don't know much about them, right? Like deploy ocean alkalinity enhancement. Right, so there's, if you see down there on the bottom, it says keep watching. These are solutions that we believe have potential, but we just don't know enough yet, right? The science isn't there, but capital can be catalytic in this space to let us learn more. And we really want to encourage people to, if you have a higher risk appetite, go for a keep watching solution, right? Or look towards those. If you have a lower risk appetite, go for what we deem highly recommended, but we really recommend staying away from these non-recommended, which don't actually, like I've said, move the needle on climate change. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to show you a little example and talk about our TLC approach where I don't know if this translates to New Zealand, but in the US we always say like, oh, the earth could use a little tender love and care. And when we were sitting out and thinking about all like the scientific lenses with which we apply to climate solutions to see if they might work in an area, we were like, oh, time, location, co-benefits. And of course, our marketing guy, because everybody needs a marketing guy, right? He was like, TLC. So that's where this TLC came from. But I'm going to use this example of improved rice production and cultivation in Indonesia to talk a little bit about how we first work with partners to what I call identify their decision space. What are their values? What's their theory of change? What do they need in an ROI, right? Because everybody needs some sort of ROI, but investors need a financial ROI, whereas philanthropic donors sometimes need, community enhancement or, something else. Philanthropy comes from the heart. So ROI looks different in that kind of space. But we really need to learn what people are interested in, what their non-negotiables are, what their geographic interests are, what their values are. Once we know that, once we've defined the decision space where people want to act, we then apply this time, location, co-benefits scientific approach to it to help them identify opportunities there. So with one example, rice cultivation in Indonesia was, and the terminology is escaping me right now, but essentially they were repeatedly flooded, and then a lot of methane would emit. So while the rice cultivation is very, very important, this more common way of doing it right in like the last few decades created a lot of methane emissions, which is a greenhouse gas that we talk about a lot less than carbon, but it burns really hot. It's way more intense than carbon dioxide, but it doesn't stick around in the atmosphere as long. But we do talk about if you want to make an impact on the climate crisis quickly, do something to address methane emissions. Next slide, please. So here you'll see, we think of methane as an emergency brake solution, a solution that you can like address and hit right now and make an impact in the near term, while longer term solutions that address carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, they take a while. If you're planting trees or, improving the way a forest is managed or improving rangeland management, those things move slowly, whereas, addressing methane makes an impact quickly. So we found through our research in Southeast Asia that rice production generated almost 1/3 of regional methane emissions. And we also found that if we improved water management on those rice fields, that could reduce emissions by 64 metric tons of CO2 equivalent, which is how we talk about these greenhouse gases, without even reducing any rice yields. So next slide. And then location. We identified the highest impact interventions, and that they were located in actually a really small number of geographies. And in Vietnam specifically, if farmers or land managers made this shift to non-continuous rice paddy flooding, they could cut these rice-related emissions by 60%, again, without lowering yields. Next slide. And I've just got 2 more slides after this. So, and then co-benefits, right? If you change this management practice, which can rapidly address greenhouse gas pollution, there are also ways to address human health, land resources, water quality, possibly livelihoods. There's all of these co-benefits that are benefits over and above the greenhouse gas mitigation that very often, again, if you're here on this call, these are things that you probably think about, right, as a sustainable investor or a development practitioner. Next slide. So the takeaway there really is that climate capital can be far more impactful when it's supercharged by science, when we apply a scientific lens to capital allocation. And then my penultimate slide is next. And I'll just say that where we fit in Project Drawdown as an organization is we're really the bridge from this scientific knowledge production, which we then, identify, verify. Our team of 20 scientists out of 26 employees work on this scientific knowledge production, but then we also translate that to real world decisions and real world value shifts. So, every organization's trying to find their lane, and this is where we say our lane is. So while I'm talking about capital here, it's really coming from a position as a scientist. And then finally, I just have a thank you slide, and I'll go enter into a conversation with Andy. So thanks for listening to me for a few minutes, and excited to talk more.
Thanks, Lauren. It's really insightful, I guess, to hear both more about yourself, but also Drawdown. So thanks for going into that. And I think, I think it should be news to no one that weather events are worsening, increasing in severity. Being a Brit, I was on the BBC News app the other day, and I think 3 of the top 6 stories were weather event related. And I was also reading that the Tour de France this year was 6 degrees warmer than all the recent average, which is obviously, when you're talking about 1.5 and 2 degrees. I know it's not like for like, but it feels pretty insane.
No, but I will say 2 things. One is that I live in Boulder, Colorado, in a little town next to Boulder called Louisville. The first reason is because I used to race bikes, so all of my friends either have raced the Tour or are racing the Tour right now.
Okay.
But the other, so we hear about it, right? Like they're struggling, and what do you wear, a cooling vest as an athlete? Like, no, you can't in a race like that. So it is really challenging. And then the other thing I would say is that about 4 years ago, my town had a mega urban wildfire, and we lost 1,000 homes and businesses. And that's all to say, like, no one is isolated, right? And it shows up in weird ways. I never thought my town would have burned in a wildfire. But in the UK, right, the heat, in the South Pacific right now, there's storms. It's showing up in so many different ways.
Yeah, yeah, completely. I think the awareness and understanding of the precarious position that we're in will be increasing dramatically across the board. Yeah, completely.
Mhm.
Okay, cool. So we jump in. So your role at Drawdown includes guiding philanthropies, investors, and institutions in aligning capital with science-based, high integrity, equitable climate strategies. And you touched on some of this in terms of what your level of risk is. But so how do you see the role of capital across those different groups? So philanthropies, investors, institutions, and how does that shape the conversations you have with them, the advice that you give them, and yeah, give us a little bit of flavor of that.
Well, it's pretty interesting. When I talked about that TLC approach, that really can help us with philanthropists identify, like, you're interested in this geographic area. Say you're interested in New Zealand, right? You're interested in New Zealand. You went there on vacation as an American or something like that. It's very charismatic. You watched all those movies filmed there. Um, and you're also interested in agriculture because you're interested in food, and you're also interested in oceans, right? Or water. And we might start to think about what is a way to think about, what your values are. What does agriculture look like in a way where philanthropic capital is needed? Is there like a capacity to draw it in is from like organizations or what? But if you're even an impact investor who might accept a lower ROI on an investment, you still do want an ROI. So there's a risk question that comes onto it, right? Because the philanthropy is giving. But if you want something back, there's that risk component that goes with the TLC approach. And then when we're thinking about risk, we're also like, what do you want out of it? How would you get an ROI back, right?
Mm.
Is it that there's a technology that could scale? Is it that there's like data that could scale or data be useful to your organization down the line? Like, what is it within this intervention that you see is possible to create capital that could come back to you?
Yeah,
So in some ways it's a similar approach, and then there's another layer when you need an ROI.
yeah, and so is there kind of a rough kind of split of how much of your work and conversations are with philanthropies versus people who are looking for ROI, or is it kind of philanthropy heavy, or?
We went into this work initially through philanthropy because we are a nonprofit, and it was actually a lot of our partners were like, "Can you help us think through this?"
Hmm.
So that was an easy entry point for us. But I mean, and I'm sure your audience knows this. A lot of philanthropists are there because they're wealthy and they're also investors,
Yeah.
right? Or if you have, an endowment, you're interested. So some of the conversations are with the same people. We also work with like, impact investing networks and investor groups and things like that.
And you talked about impact investors who may accept kind of concessionary level of returns, reduced ROI, but do you also work with investors who are looking for commercial returns, but just looking for commercial returns in the climate solution space?
Not in this role. I've done that previously, but not in this role. And I will say, that's a different beast, right? Because they're willing to take even a larger risk, but they also might want, it's a balance of like either they want a very established market, that they want to play big in, or they want, they're willing to go with like a less mature market, but take a higher risk. So it is it's a different beast in some ways.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thanks. And I guess following on from that, um, is it, I guess, is it commercial business model that enables you guys to distinguish between something that needs investment versus something that fundamentally needs funding, and kind of how does blended finance work? And
Yeah,
kind of,
so
yeah.
I could talk a little bit about like how blended finance is so important. One of the analogies I always use is if you look at a climate solution starting to scale or be enacted, it almost looks like a flaky croissant of financialization, right? There's all of these layers together, right? If you cut a croissant down the middle and you're like, oh wow, right? There's so many different layers of butter and flour or whatever. That is what blended finance in my brain looks like. And every one of those layers is really, really important because sometimes they beget another layer, right? So there's never actually, none of these types of agreements are the same across the board. Sometimes the private money will draw in the private, sometimes philanthropic capital that takes that risk and becomes catalytic, makes it safer for other people to jump in. So one of the examples I always use is of a forest conservation project that was in the state of Maine in the northeastern US that I studied for my doctoral dissertation. And there was a small land trust with like 3 or 4 employees, and they wanted to start acquiring timberlands for conservation because it's a sporting area. And one of the ways they had no money. So one of the ways they thought they could do that was by buying the initial land and enrolling it in a carbon project, a carbon offset project tied to the California cap and trade market, and also to the voluntary market. So they did that and they got an initial $4 million from that. And then suddenly wealthy neighbors were like, oh yeah, if we put in more money, we can get more land for conservation. And then the state saw that and was like, oh, we can like push you over the edge to get your, final 60,000 acres that you want. So it really became like all of these people working together and sort of inspired by each other and comforted in some ways, like reassured by one another, that creates that capital stack. That's so interesting. But I mean, every project will look different in that space.
And so interesting there, you kind of what you the specific project you're talking about there. I guess bridges both climate mitigation but also adaptation to some extent. And so
Absolutely. And also, as like a social scientist, I'm like, climate mitigation and adaptation are too similar. We don't need to make it a binary. But yes. So I'll let you finish your question. But yes.
no. I was going to ask because I'm like, to what extent does drawdown? So you kind of fended off the question before I've asked it a little bit there, but to what extent does drawdown engage in what you'd maybe describe as pure play adaptation, or do you kind of see it as, or A, do you not think there is pure play adaptation, just based on your point, or B, is it there needs to be an element of mitigation within the project?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
So frankly, a lot of times mitigation funds the adaptation. But we're a science-based organization, so we don't actually tell people where to put their capital. We just say like this type of project is effective. So I think that part, that's why we're mitigation focused, because we're actually looking at how carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is mitigated.
Yeah.
But those things they happen, they need each other, I think.
Yeah, no, that's a really good way of putting it. Mitigation funds adaptation. When I was over in London recently, and I was listening to a talk around nature-based nature restoration. There was commercial businesses doing nature restoration, and they were kind of very, very clear that they had one single revenue stream, and it was carbon credits. And so, but yeah, okay, cool. So changing track a little bit. So you often hear that a significant kind of percentage of global emissions can be eliminated with existing commercially available technologies. And Drawdown distinguishes between solutions, so any given technology that contributes to a lower level of emissions, and levers, policy, regulations, etc., that help those solutions to scale. How much emphasis does Drawdown place on the levers? So appreciate there's a lot of focus on solutions. Does Drawdown work on those levers as well? And where do you think the biggest opportunities are to accelerate deployment of scalable solutions?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And if someone wants to give us a huge amount of money, we would love to hire people to work on those levers. But right now, we've got 1 or 2 people. But the levers are what makes it possible. And actually, when we work with philanthropists, they're very often interested in those enabling conditions, right? The policy shifts. And it's like, if you think about, and again, I can't speak to the New Zealand, version of this, but in the US, like permitting slows down so many promising climate interventions. So it's like, oh, we would love you to put up solar panels and help clean our grid, but you got to get the permit to get through to like be able to build them on that land. And it really kneecaps a lot of potential. So we see a lot of sort of philanthropic capital coming in and saying, that's why we call it catalytic, right? Let's enact policy change or social movements that can get that happening, ballot measures, things like that. But again, these things, they need each other. If we don't have enabling conditions to support these climate interventions, then there's no climate intervention, right? Like they just exist in a vacuum, but this is why I think like I've been able to make a career as a human environment geographer or social scientist in this space, because I'm like, what about the people? Like it's great if you've got solar panels, but we need people to help them get in the ground and connect to the grid and, turn on our lights here.
Yeah. And so have you seen examples of government policy that you'd say has been genuinely catalytic in scaling climate solutions? And conversely, do you have any examples of where well-intentioned policy maybe hasn't worked very well?
Yes, because I'm from the US. Let me roll out the scroll, but it's been a rough couple of years here, but I would say that here's an example, right? We had for a few years really incredible tax incentives. And this is something that I tell students when I teach. Sometimes the climate policies that are most effective are like the most boring, right? They're not sexy. It's a tax rebate or a tax incentive. But to buy an electric car, and you could buy an electric car really, really inexpensively. I mean, like less than $100 a month, some people were paying to lease a brand new electric vehicle. And $6,000 rebate that you got back if you purchased this car. So then suddenly all of these people had electric vehicles, and they weren't making that choice because it was the green thing or the climate thing. They were making that choice because it was the smart financial move. And we saw an incredible uptake on electric vehicles, and to make that possible, electric vehicle support, right? So like charging stations around the country. But then as soon as those rebates get dialed back, the purchasing of those cars drops too. So it's a real ecosystem, right? Like we think about ecosystem as, ecologists and biodiversity and things like that. Or, as farmers, we say, diversification minimizes risk. You don't want to grow one kind of plant, but we need that diversification in the social and the financial space as well. I mean, that's why we have mutual funds too, right? Diversification, but.
Yeah, I think, I completely agree with you that, the economics needs to stack up for people to make decisions, right? And you either wait until the technology is fundamentally cheaper, thinking about EVs. Now that takes a long time. It requires probably other countries to have subsidies and policies and things like that to drive down those costs. Or you wait for a crisis. So there's EV sales in this country have boomed since February, unsurprisingly. Or you deliver it through policy. Yeah, completely agree on that. Yeah.
Geopolitics can't be separated from the sort of condition in which climate solutions can be enabled and enacted.
Yeah. And so what be your key messages to banks and investors in New Zealand? How should we think about allocating capital between proven technologies, emerging technologies, and areas where smaller markets like ours may be better off waiting for larger economies to drive down cost and risk? There's a difficult balance or friction, I guess, sometimes in that it's great to be a world leader of things, but you have to be cognizant that you can't be a world leader in everything. Sometimes it's better to kind of wait until it's economically sensible to chart a certain course. So would be interested in your views on that.
I mean, I think, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, solar PV wasn't economically sensible. And now it's like on price parity with oil. So I think sometimes these things just need to mature. But as far as like how to allocate your capital, the first step I think a lot of financial institutions need to take is to don't underestimate the power of climate change, right? If you look at JP Morgan Chase in the US, one of our mega banks, they have a climate scientist in their leadership, who used to head our who was our chief scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric and Oceanic sciences, and that's because they are keenly aware that climate change is going to impact every single one of their investments, right? And every single one of the assets that they hold. So if you're an asset holder, period, you should care about climate change. The second thing is that we know scientifically, if you want to sort of take a gamble or, go with something that's more proven and more entrenched already, we know what works and what's effective. So we really encourage you to lean on scientific resources to make sure that the investments that you make actually move the needle on concentrations of carbon dioxide, atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so we've got some questions that have come in, so I'll cover off some of these. So firstly, how important is carbon pricing, do you think, in determining capital allocation? And I would say, for context, we have a emissions trading scheme here that I can't profess to know everything about, but I think there's accusations that it has been pretty ineffective.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I sort of, the joke in my family is like I live and breathe carbon markets. So if anyone wants to talk emissions trading, here for it, LinkedIn me or something. But I think the problem with emissions trading schemes in general is twofold. The first is that the price is too low. So we've often been told that, or science has showed that the price of carbon per ton needs to be like $100 to $1,000, and right now it's like $7 to $100. These are US things, but put in any type of currency, you can see, the order. There's orders of magnitude difference in what's actually going to change behavior. So it's almost like kind of like flooded with credits that are valued so low that they just become administrative fees to keep the market going. And then I think the other thing why they've been ineffective is because they allow offsetting, and offsetting just allows someone to pollute if they invest in sustainable development somewhere else. And those things very often, like we know, because we've had these markets around for 20, 25 years, that balance doesn't actually happen. So that's part of the fundamental flaw with those markets.
And when you say that balance doesn't actually happen, is that a kind of a credit quality thing?
I mean, it is credit quality, but it's like one of the weird things about carbon dioxide as a commodity is that it's never actually traded. Like we trade barrels of oil and bars of gold, but when we trade carbon, we trade agreed upon representations of carbon. So like you're trading like what might grow in trees that are planted in Indonesia with something coming out of a smokestack in Germany. And there's so much bureaucracy that goes into making those two forms of carbon legible that it's really, really hard to trace. And we just, you really have to trust that those carbon credits are equal, but it's really wonky still.
Yeah, okay. And just while we're on carbon sequestration, well, so from an engineer perspective, does Drawdown have kind of a view on carbon capture or direct air capture?
Yeah, so Drawdown in particular is not really a fan of engineered solutions. And one of those reasons is because they're really expensive, they're not proven, and they take a long time to come on board. So that's the Drawdown take. And the other reason is there's so many solutions that we already have in our back pocket that if they just had more finance to scale, we could start, the action can happen quickly.
Yeah, and I think you've answered kind of the next piece where I was going is that with Drawdown, it's not just whether or not the technology works, it's whether or not it works commercially. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's like, is it actually going to happen?
Yeah.
Right? Can it, like, we could keep putting, billions of dollars towards something. The other thing is that very often direct air capture is used for enhanced oil recovery. So while the technology, has molecules that selectively bind to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and pull them down, what gets drawn down is then used to extract more oil. And so then it's also almost like a perverse incentive.
Yeah, okay. Okay, another question is, you mentioned that some solution narratives are more intriguing to funders than others, but not as effective as the less sexy solution. So, e.g., improving farming practices versus vertical farming. So I think the same impacts the mitigation versus adaptation challenge. Any thoughts on how we can shift that conversation so the focus becomes the boring but the effective?
I know, I feel like the boring needs like a good Instagram, right? Like the solar needs like a 20-year-old running like their TikTok or something to like improve the messaging. But I think as financiers, we need to be more savvy. And that's not like an insult or anything like that. It's just like, how is anyone supposed to know climate change science? Like I spent 20 years thinking about it and I'm still like sometimes unsure, right? So that's why I think partnerships are really, really important. And it's like, if you're a banker, if you're an investor, if you're a philanthropist, call your climate science friend. Don't just fall for this narrative that's like intentionally telling you how something is great. I went to a pitch a couple years ago, like a pitch night, where all these climate tech startups told stories and they were all like so smooth and so good. And then I was like sitting next to a soil scientist, and she was like, that technology doesn't work. It's not going to work, you know? And I think, yeah, we can't do this alone. No one can address the climate crisis alone, and we certainly can't choose the best places to allocate funding without like a partnership with you know, someone who's helping guide us through science. And I need someone who's helping guide me through money. You know, it's we all need each other.
Yeah, and I think what we got a lot of focus on how we can get more capital into adaptation financing at the moment, and I think that yeah, it's it's easier probably to attract people to the story that you've got a climate solution that's going to change the world versus investing in making space for water, which is going to reduce your future costs. And so it's kind of difficult to think about how you enhance the narrative around that second one.
Well, Andy, actually, can I tell you something about that?
Please.
Okay, so we all know about carbon offsets probably, but there's been a push recently to carbon insetting, and that's where corporates invest in climate mitigation within their supply chain, or like protecting water within their supply chain. And part of that is that sustainable development finance that would be part of an offset stays within the company and helps strengthen it, right? And make a company more resilient. But it also helps mobilize marketing dollars, right? And get more people on board. It tells a good story. Your company's getting more resilient. Suddenly, other parts of the company care because, their supply chain is going to be strengthened or supported, enabled. And it's been a really interesting sort of turn of phrase where it's still money going to sustainable development to address carbon mitigations, carbon pollution elsewhere. But this way, you're suddenly like companies have been able to get so much more financing on board because because of that narrative in the story.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I hadn't heard about that, so I'll check it out. Okay, and so again, against the backdrop of, as we touched on, increasingly visible climate impacts, what gives you the most optimism about the path to net zero, and what are the one or two barriers that, if overcome, could most dramatically accelerate decarbonisation?
If I knew the one or two barriers, I think I'd just go and raise some venture capital and invest it and go, hang out on the beach in Fiji. But I think, the thing that makes me really hopeful is that, first of all, we know what it takes to address the climate crisis. We know we have it. We have the Drawdown Explorer. It tells us what it is. The second thing is that I teach at a university still part-time, and there's young folks who were born into climate change. They've been thinking about climate change their entire lives. And while it creates a burden on them, it also makes them comfortable enough to say, let's figure out how to address it. So, we have a really motivated next generation. When I was in my 20s, I was learning about climate change and I had to explain it to everyone I talked to. Now people in their 20s are like, yeah, climate change, let's act. And that's a ray of hope for me, is that we have people who are ready. We don't have to like get them up to speed, which is sad in some ways too. but it has been like positive to interact with these young folks, and they're excited to get going on it. I think a couple of the hurdles, the one hurdle is capital, right? Like we have capital, we have people who are ready to deploy capital in a multitude of ways through the capital stack. But the disconnect is that they need more guidance as to like where and how, and we need better science communication to tell them. So I think if we can get that story out better, we could mobilize more capital to the solutions that we know work.
Okay, cool, thanks. And so I got more questions. So one question is, what the single biggest thing or solution the world needs to do? Is that what you'd say that is? Better connection between the capital that's out there and I guess
Yeah.
making things investable, but also making people understand where that capital is going to have the greatest impact?
Yeah, and I think like that person probably wants a specific intervention. And, I could give like this my swirly answer again of like better communication and friendship. But I think, the one thing is like we got to leave the coal in the ground, like stop the extraction and in the oil. So we need to really slow the extraction and combustion of fossil fuels. Right? That's what is perpetuating the climate crisis. That's what got us here, from the Industrial Revolution on, and it's what is perpetuating it. So it's like turn off the faucet first. We know that like we will always need some sort of residual use of fossil fuels, but like we have so many alternatives now that are cheap. Let's look to them.
Okay, cool. There's a biodiversity specific US one here. So the US has biodiversity banking. Do you know how successful that scheme is in incentivizing nature-based solutions that have mitigation or adaptation benefits?
Yeah, the biodiversity banking hasn't scaled as much as like wetlands banking and other types of banking, right? They're all modeled after the same types of payments for ecosystem services. It's starting to come up, and we're seeing it more like people are bundling it with other things. So like endangered species credits, biodiversity credits, wetlands credits, and then maybe even some carbon credits. So again, it's another type of capital stack that's going into conservation. Also, sometimes that biodiversity funding goes by like slightly different names and gets federal government funding. That's been a pretty steady income for a lot of large landholders. So I think sometimes if you scratch the surface at what things are called, you might see that they're happening in a multitude of spaces and ways, and that's pretty encouraging to me.
Good, thank you. Okay, there's a couple more. This one's a long question, so apologies, I haven't had
I'm
the chance
ready.
to.
I'm ready.
Yeah. Okay, so we can see that in the public equities space, capital naturally piles into shiny pure play poster children like EVs and solar. I appreciate that drawdown flagged solutions like food waste, building efficiency, or soil health, but these are usually buried inside multi-industrial conglomerates or absent from public markets altogether. So for equity managers willing to look across asset classes, e.g. private markets, real assets, or labeled debt like green or orange bonds, what are the smartest ways to get real pure play exposure to these unglamorous high impact opportunities? And what have you seen as the hurdles preventing most institutional capital from making a leap into these areas?
Yeah, excellent question. I'm curious where that person did their MBA. That's a very MBA question, but I love it. I think I think the answer is location, right? So like solar PV, right? Renewables, we could put them in California. California is already incredibly amenable to that, and they have a clean grid. If we put them on the other side of the US in Indiana or West Virginia, where the grid is by and large coal dependent, you can really make a change. So that's why we talk about the location. The example I gave was the rice methane, but with solar siting, that's really huge. One of the problems is like transmission lines. So to be effective in that space, we often see really wealthy folks going in and working with unions. Sorry, this is like American labor language. I don't know how it translates, but working with like the folks who build transmission lines and transport large things via railway. working with those sort of infrastructure movements to get the setup up and running, but it costs a lot of money, right? So if you're an asset holder, how can you leverage the assets you have, particularly real assets, to like site the solar on it, or support transmission lines to a grid that's amenable to taking your clean energy? It really becomes like a puzzle,
Yeah,
right? Because like I said, none of these things can operate in isolation. You can have solar, but if it's not connected through transmission lines, then it's not going to scale.
and in terms of I guess into some of those uh, less visible solutions, so like soil health, etc. Is there ways for kind of equity managers, asset managers, etc., to get greater exposure to those types of opportunities? Have you seen how that's possible?
Yeah, and I think like I'm going to New York City Climate Week, which is, our financial city. You might see this at you know, I don't know how your climate weeks operate, right? But the banks are suddenly really interested in holding a lot of workshops and spaces for people. And I think it's just showing up more. So it probably wouldn't take like a ton. It wouldn't be really hard to find guidance within like the markets that you operate, because I can guarantee people are thinking about it. Also because like, we don't, there's so much uncertainty in the future that, you know, uh, interventions, power technologies that help make us resilient, people want to get in there early.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
They're, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I've got one more. So do you see the connection of capital to innovation as living in the private industry, private sector space, or do you think that compliance should be leading the way? So there's more regulation around it, I guess.
I mean, I really think like beyond the European emissions trading system, the compliance markets for carbon in particular have really been anemic and haven't taken off. There's been other compliance things like the US Clean Air Act that has really changed the way pollution, exists in the US or is managed in the US. But we really need both, right? We need the compliance sector to incentivize or push some parts of the private sector into this space. And we really, really need private capital, particularly as there's this like, wealth inequity. We have some people that are incredible capital holders or institutions that are incredible capital holders. They can really make change. And it behooves them, it's in their best interest to act on climate.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Look, I think we're at the end. So look, thank you again, Lauren, for your time and sharing your insights with us. I will especially take away the blended finance croissant analogy. I very much enjoy that. It's made me hungry. But look, thank you again. That's been awesome, really useful. So thank you very much for your time. We know how great. We know how important it is to bring international perspectives and practical insights to the sustainable finance conversation in New Zealand. Okay, thank you, everyone. We look forward to bringing you a conversation later this year with 2025 Nobel Prize in Economic Services recipient, Professor Philippe Aghion. I hope I've got that right. So watch out for more information on that coming soon. And thank you very much. Cheers.